The Honourable Dr Michael Cullen.
So I'm going to begin by recognising that Mr Power, in chairing this committee, ensured that due process was followed and that all those who gave evidence to the committee were allowed to do so in a reasonable fashion and with a degree of protection against any undue activity on the part of any members of the Select Committee. It would seem to me that there were three questions which the committee needed to ask itself. First question is, did Mr Peters know about the Owen Glen donation? The second question is, if he did not, should he in any case have found out about it, for reasons that I'll explore a little later on? And the third is, should he have declared that donation on the pecuniary interest register? In order for the finding in the majority to stand, it seems to me that one has to answer yes to either questions 1 and 3. In other words, Mr Peters knew and should have declared it, or to questions 2 and 3, that he should have found out about it and declared it. If there is a no to either 1 or 3 or 2 or 3, then, in fact, the contempt finding cannot be found. There is a high standard to apply because the finding of contempt and a motion of censure is an extremely serious matter. I could find in Dave McGee's book only 3 references to motions of censure in the last 35 years or so of this Parliament. In facing the first question, Mr Peters know about the Owen Glen donation. We were faced, as I said at the time, with 2 conflicting narratives. Narrative A, Mr Glen's, was that Mr Peters contacted him on the 5th of December, leaving a message to phone Mr Peters. That conversation occurred on the 14th of December. During that conversation, Mr Peters sought a donation. That donation was $100,000. Mr Peters then contacted Mr Henry. Mr Henry transferred his bank details to Mr Glen. And that narrative has a high degree of credibility about it on the face of it. The alternative narrative is a different one. Let me deal with the first narrative first. Much of that depends on the reliability of Mr Glen as a witness. Mr Glen was fine as long as he stuck to the carefully coached matters that he went through, rehearsed by his lawyer, Mr Harley, Dr Harley, who in fact, interestingly enough, was appearing pro bono publico for no fees, despite being one of the most expensive lawyers in the country and being at the middle of the wine box affair in which Mr Peters had a starring role on the other side of the script. Mr Glen, of course, however, unburdened himself the next day of a whole series of statements and indeed managed to contradict himself on many different occasions. He said the donation was to New Zealand First, and he said it was to Mr Peters. He said he made the donation to Labor because of the exclusive brethren, an impossibility since the donation was made before the relationship between Nash and the exclusive brethren was known. And then this morning on Morning Report contradicted himself yet again by saying the donation to Labor had nothing to do with the exclusive brethren. He claimed that Mr Williams arrived at his home in the south of France uninvited when Mr Williams today produced the email from Mr Glen inviting him. He claimed that Mr Williams asked for a job, when in fact it was Mr Glen that offered Mr Williams a job. He claimed to have been invited to the Caracas sales by Mr Peters, when in fact Mr Peters is not the person who invites people to tables at the Caracas sales. It is people who are involved directly in the racing industry. He claimed to have sat at the same table as Mr Peters when a series of affidavits showed in fact that they did not lunch together at that particular function. In other words, Mr Glen was a not entirely reliable witness. Furthermore, he showed extreme resentment of being questioned. He seemed to regard the New Zealand Select Committee as something which was rather like a kind of third-level flunkies in his organisation. If they were told what the facts were, those are the facts that were to be accepted. He threatened to walk up, and he was not questioned very hard at all. I've seen much harder questioning by any members of this House on all sides in Select Committee processes than Mr Glen was subject to. In other words, he was a person used to getting his own way and did not like it when he appeared not to be getting his own way. That could colour his attitude on matters such as donations. So the alternative narrative, therefore, is that, in fact, as Mr Henry submitted and Mr Peters submitted, Mr Henry made the approach to Mr Glen for the donation, which is much more likely to have occurred in any case, given the nature of who does approach people for substantial donations. That Mr Glenn indeed called Mr Peters, because that is absolutely clear, and during that conversation mentioned that he wanted Mr Henry's details, that Mr Peters conveyed that fact to Mr Henry, and Mr Henry contacted Mr Glenn. Those are two different narratives, and one can choose between them. Only those with a totally prejudiced mind, such as Dr Smith, will conclude that only one of those narratives has credibility to it. Both those narratives have credibility to them. And the majority found it was the first narrative which was correct. The minority has serious doubts about that narrative. But in fact, it's the least important of the questions, because of course, because in fact, even if that's true, then we have to proceed on to question 3. But let's deal with question 2. Let's assume that narrative 2 is correct, that in fact Mr Glenn was approached by Mr Henry for the donation, and matters unfolded as I outlined just previously. Then we have the argument, which was based on a submission from the former clerk Dave McGee, who was invited to make submission by the committee at my suggestion, that in fact one should have to make an honest attempt, and that meant a much more serious delving back into the past about where donations may have come from, based in this case upon the undisputed fact that Mr Henry indicated that he would tell Mr Peters, or had told Mr Peters, that people contributed to Mr Henry's legal expenses. The expenses which did of themselves, as Mr Powers just outlined, create a debt and could not, because Mr Henry practised as a barrister sole. And what is more, the committee was further told that in fact if the money did not come forth and Mr Peters was unable to pay the money, there was no obligation upon Mr Peters at all, other than a moral one perhaps, in order to pay that money. In other words, any payment of Mr Henry's legal expenses did not thereby reduce any kind of payment that Mr Peters might make to Mr Henry. The problem with the honest attempt test, however, that is basically a construction arrived at by the Select Committee on the advice of Mr McGee, and is imported backwards to the affair in early 2006. So we invite members to think very carefully. This exposes many people in this House at risk in terms of any wide range of donations and services, or undercharging for services such as legal services. And I think there may be many members who might care to think carefully about whether the returns that they made at the start of 2006 may be entirely accurate in all respects, in the light of that changing interpretation of members' obligations. But then there is still the highest hurdle to cross. Even if all those facts follow, and Mr Peters should have found out about the donation or already knew about the donation, the real issue comes to that point is, should he have made a return? Well, what the registrar told us was that if members approached her for advice about whether a matter required a return, she would advise them to ask their lawyer and seek legal advice, which is why the committee has recommended that the registrar should make more rulings on these matters. But what if Mr Peters had done that and had approached his lawyer for advice on this matter? Mr Henry submitted that, in fact, a return was not required, on 2 grounds: that, in fact, it was not a gift to Mr Peters, because there was no obligation to pay on Mr Peters' part, and on 2nd grounds, and in Mr Henry's view, it was an electoral expense related to the electoral petition, and electoral expenses are specifically exempted from the requirement to make a return under the Pecuniary Interest Register. The committee concluded that both those points were wrong, but that is not the point. The point is that that is the advice that Mr Peters would have had he followed what Dame Margaret Bazley said should be done. In other words, how can one conclude on the basis of this and engage in a motion of censure on a member that he knowingly made a false return, when in fact if he'd followed what is recommended through this process, he would have been advised he did not need to make a return on these matters? That is why, Madam Speaker, this party, the Labor Party, will not be voting for this motion. There is a conflict of evidence here. There's a high test that should be applied in the end, because a very serious motion that has been passed. And I think the House needs to think very clearly whether for political purposes on the eve of an election it should be engaging in this public hanging, and no doubt Mr Brownlee, as an ex-carpenter, is the man keen to erect the scaffold.